All right, I can see people starting to join now, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone, my name is Caitlin. I'm the programs coordinator at Urban Green. And before we get started, I'm just gonna do a quick technical overview. We are taking questions during the second half of today's discussion. And so we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box. It'll either be at the top or bottom of your screen. We ask that you just put it in the Q&A box and not in the chat so that it's easier for our moderator to monitor those questions as they come in. If you have any technical issues at all during the program, feel free to email me at kl@urbangreencouncil.org and I'll get you sorted as quickly as possible. I also want to take a minute before today's discussion to talk about Urban Green's organizational values to just kind of set the tone for today's discussion. Urban Green uses these values to guide our work, and as a part of our commitment to fostering inclusive and respectful dialogue, we ask that all participants today are mindful of these values during the discussion of inclusion, collaboration, engagement. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to get us started today.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Good morning to all of you in the United States. Good afternoon to those. I know we have a few joining from London. Welcome to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyke, the CEO of Urban Green. I'm coming to you from Studio Urban Green in Lower Manhattan. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a zero carbon future. And you get to participate too, because we will have live Q&A, as Caitlin mentioned, in just a little bit. Today's program is being made possible through a sponsorship from Carrier. So we want to thank Carrier for its support of the program, and we certainly want to thank Carrier for its longstanding support of the green building movement overall. So thank you to our friends at Carrier. Today, we're going to take a look at the big issue of net zero carbon emissions. It's a goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is why so many companies and so many countries are making net zero commitments, including the United States just 2 weeks ago. But what really is net zero? How is it measured? And how do we actually get there? So to help answer these questions, we're going to London today to speak to my guest and my friend, Julie Hirigoyen, who's the CEO of the UK Green Building Council. Julie, welcome to Urban Green Live.
Thank you very much, John. Lovely to see you and be with you all today.
Yeah, it's great that you are spending some time with us, and we really appreciate that. Julie, we've been excited to get you on the program because the UK has been a leader in net zero for so long. Just some grounding facts for our audience. 1/3 of the UK publicly traded companies have net zero commitments, which is really impressive. And the UK as a country overall is already 51% towards its national net zero goal in 2050. So Julie, my first question to you is, how did net zero become so mainstream in the UK?
It is a really good question because it is quite recent, I think, that the actual concept of net zero has really taken off. I mean, until just last year, our national legal emissions reduction target, well, actually it was a couple of years ago, our national emissions reduction target was 80% reduction by 2050. And through lobbying from ourselves and a number of other organizations, including advice from the Committee on Climate Change, which is a unique body that we have here that sort of holds our government to account on its emissions reduction trajectory, the overwhelming kind of push at that time was that's not going to be far enough, fast enough. And as a more developed nation, we need to get to net zero by 2050. I think it's really since the IPCC 1.5 degree report came out, which was 2019, I think 2018, 2019. And that evidence that showed what 1.5 degrees of warming versus 2 degrees of warming means from a ecological, economic, social, geopolitical point of view, the penny really dropped. And I think at that point, you know, countries like the UK probably started to realize that the target is zero and we've just got to get there as fast as possible if we're to stand a chance of, you know, averting runaway climate change, if I can put it like that. So it's really only been a couple of years that we've been on that kind of zero focused trajectory.
Well, the progress is really impressive. You know, when I talk about net zero here in the United States, you get the sense that people intellectually understand the broad picture of like what net zero really means, but actually when you drill down to it, they aren't really familiar with how it's measured and how it's defined. So maybe we could start there with you. So how do you define net zero and how do you measure it?
That's a really, that's a really important point for buildings in particular, right? Because there are different aspects of the life cycle of the building that could be deemed to be net zero or not. So what we did at UKGBC was back in, again, 2019, we launched a framework definition of what net zero carbon buildings should mean. And we, in order to clarify that, we said there are really three definitions that we ought to be working with. One is for new construction, new developments altogether. And if just the new construction piece, as soon as the building is completed, it is deemed to have been net zero carbon in construction, then all of the embodied carbon, the materials usage, the transportation to and from site, the on-site activities and emissions in putting the building up and so on, would need to be massively reduced and offset upon completion of that construction project. So that's kind of, net, that and or met with renewable capacity, of course. That's really net zero in construction. But then for an existing building, and to your point on measurement, we've had the term zero carbon bandied around, even in policy terms in the UK, for about 10 years. And that's never meant actual net zero emissions in usage. It's always either been based on kind of modeled energy performance in a design model of some sort, or only some of the emissions associated with running the building. So just the regulated emissions, not including power loads and IT and various other important components to what happens in a building. So we ensured that our definition of net zero in operation would need to be measured basically on all energy uses within the building on an annual basis, like everything that happens in the building. And then that is, again, dramatically reduced as the first priority, met with renewable power sources where feasible, either on or off-site, and then any residual emissions offset with credible sources. And then if one were to do the whole life cycle of the building, you'd have to do both of those on a continuous basis and include all the kind of maintenance and renewal and repairs and so on. So typically the scope is what's being probably not well or explicitly mentioned when people are talking about zero carbon, carbon neutral, net zero carbon buildings. Really important to get into the detail of which bit, what scope, does it include embodied? Is it all energy uses? It gets quite, the devil's in the detail if one wants to get it right.
Right. I mean, has there been an attempt in the UK to standardize those definitions and approaches? I mean, I think what's really interesting that I don't think a lot of people know in the United States is our Securities and Exchange Commission regulates publicly traded companies. The Biden administration has hired ESG experts for the first time to be implanted in the SEC. And I think that is an initial first step to talk about how we standardize some of these terms, particularly net zero. Is there a similar activity happening in the UK?
We had a commitment from our Chancellor last November to creating a green taxonomy, which would be effectively as there already is such a taxonomy in the EU, and no doubt ours will be much driven by what's been agreed at the EU, despite Brexit. That there'll be, that tries to take some of these terms and kind of break them down into a common standardized definition and at least ensure that, if you're talking about net zero, building or net zero city or net zero, chair or what have you, you're kind of talking about the same sorts of scopes and principles and boundaries. It's quite complex stuff. And I would say we're still at the early stages of that. Even in the built environment sector alone, and I mean, that was 2 years ago that we produced that report, as I mentioned, net zero claims abound. And I guess this next phase of work is really all about unpicking what do we really mean by renewable energy procurement? What really is credible or not credible? What do we really mean by residual emissions? What's acceptable or not? What are the energy efficiency minimum standards? What are the credible offsets? And so on and so forth. So each component part needs quite a detailed breakdown of definitions. And so we put out earlier this year a new guidance note on specifically that renewable procurement and offsetting principles. And fairly contentiously in some ways, but importantly, sort of flagged what we think is, actually not net zero, because you're not effectively you're just buying renewable energy credits rather than generating extra electricity, for example, is one really common pitfall. The devil really does end up being in the detail, which is where the disclosure is so important. And I think we don't yet have a credible standard of disclosure or verification, certainly not for buildings. There's a lot more work to be done there.
Well, just picking up on your comment about offsets leads me to my next question. There's been a big uptake in the U.S. just in the past year of corporate net zero commitments, and that's a good thing because we need more. But now there's a growing discussion about how much net versus how much zero. In other words, what's the right proportion of offsets, for example, as you just mentioned, versus actually doing the carbon reduction? So, how is the UK? What's the UKGBC view on that for buildings?
So we believe that what's needed is, at the very least, energy efficiency minimum standards, kind of thresholds of energy efficiency, tightening over time for different building types or different asset types. We put out, collaborated with many others in the sector to put out what we thought those should be for offices last year. We still haven't got clarity on that for retail, for shopping centres, for industrial. That really is needed, because for us, that's the number one priority. However much we buy renewable, we still need to drive down demand because we haven't got enough renewable to go around. So that's the first threshold in terms of not, you can't call yourself net zero by just buying offsets. You've got to reach a certain standard of efficiency first. Then you go to credible renewable procurement or on-site generation. And the only thing that we think is genuinely credible is being able to demonstrate that you're adding to the grid with more renewable electricity or power by your procurement process or your generation process. And that's the only really credible piece. Unfortunately, many or most of our energy suppliers and the way the market works in the UK are not able to offer that. So many companies think they're net zero by just buying renewables, but they're not in fact adding to the grid. So that is another myth that needs debunking, and that needs to be part of that kind of, everything before offsets. Very much, we need to decarbonize heat. So for us, that's a really big thing in the UK, which means phasing out all gas boilers and those sorts of things. And the piece that's perhaps not being talked about enough and that will become more important is the refrigerants. And for some sectors, those are really significant, like supermarkets and various others. And that's harder to do, right? Because phasing, the journey there is more challenging. So gas and refrigerants, probably two big ones, obviously oil as well. But then, so you kind of need to do all of that. And then if you do have some residual, and particularly on the embodied side, materials and kind of products and bits of kit, pretty hard to find anything that's not got some carbon emissions associated with it. So that's where I think initially a lot of the offsets, credible offsets, should be focused, whilst really, having non-negotiable standards on those other bits. And then it really is more credible, and it's actually achieving something.
Right. We have the same gas issue here in London, in New York, where 40% of our carbon emissions for the whole city of New York come from burning mostly gas, some oil at the building level for heat and hot water. That's 40% of the problem. And so, we have the same issue of, how do we transition those to, or how do we electrify those really to a grid that becomes renewable over time? So In what way has the UKGBC been promoting net zero? I mean, how do you get your members interested in onboarding?
Yeah, well, so there's two answers to that. One is much through the kind of programmatic work that I've described. You know, we're heavily involved in producing guidance, definitions, basically trying to achieve industry consensus around definitions of what is and isn't genuinely net zero, and then just by the virtue of socializing those and kind of really getting those out there, driving best practice going forwards. But more strategically, I suppose, and particularly in the run up to COP26, we have recently gone a bit further than that. So we've called very loudly and strongly for all our members, which cover businesses, local authorities, universities, charities, you name it, largely from the business community, it's built environment value chain, but the whole way through that value chain, including corporate users and occupiers. We've been calling for our members to set really ambitious climate targets. And we've pretty much aligned ourselves with the Race to Zero campaign, which is the UNFCCC backed campaign. It's almost like an umbrella campaign that sits above several initiatives. Some of the ones that are most relevant to business would be Science-Based Targets Initiative, where it's 1.5 degree aligned. So that's pretty much saying, we want you to be committing to net zero, ideally much before 2050, as soon as possible, but by no later than 2050 for sure. And set an interim target, probably 2030 target of at least 50% reductions. That's what we think is required pretty much across the piece. So we're driving them to sign up to that Race to Zero campaign. In fact, we are, as UKGBC, we are now an accelerator, recognized accelerator to that campaign, which means we're driving our members to sign up. And we're also driving our members and the wider corporate community to sign up to the World Green Building Council Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. Now, that commitment only covers kind of scopes 1 and 2 of sort of building operations. It's buildings in use, really, which is why we're really trying to push it with the occupier community. But it really is committing them to being net zero in operation across their portfolio by 2030. And the reason we're pushing that really hard is that if we get enough corporate occupiers to buy into that, then this sends a really strong demand driver signal to the marketplace, which is our membership, to deliver those buildings. So at the moment, if you go out, even in London, try and find yourself a net zero carbon building, you're going to struggle. There is not enough of that kind of really strong market demand, and we think that's really needed. So we've made strong calls for all our members to sign up to both of those. We have made our gold leaf members, which is those that we think aspire to sustainability leadership. We've made the Race to Zero requirement, a membership requirement, and that's literally in the last few weeks. And we've given them 12 months notice from their renewal period, but that's quite ambitious. And then we've made having some form of corporate commitment to climate action a membership requirement of all our corporate members. We haven't been explicitly at the moment mandating that has to be Race to Zero, because we've got lots of SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, and lots on different bits of the journey, but we've left the door open to tighten those requirements over time.
So if you fast forward to 2050, when we're successful in net zero, of course, we're still going to be burning some fossil fuels in 2050. So this is the global view of net zero, right? So would we have to shrink our carbon emissions to the lowest possible point in 2050, and then take an equal amount of carbon out of the air to get to net zero. This is why the issue of offsets we talked about. If everybody buys offsets, we never get to net zero. We have to do the hard work. So there's an emerging discussion in the United States. We just had one last week here in New York about what are those carbon removal technologies and how are they going to look in the future. Has that discussion started in the UK and London about what's the future of carbon removal?
It has started, and certainly from a sort of more encouraging kind of policy perspective, we are seeing more commitment to things like carbon capture and storage in various different forms and guises. For some of our very heavily carbon intensive industries, some of those carbon capture and storage solutions are the only way of continuing to produce some of their materials or products. So it has started, but I would say not in earnest. And the piece that I think is really interesting that is starting to resonate, particularly for built environment players like investors and developers, is that we don't just have a climate emergency, we have a massive ecological emergency. And the kind of dawning realization that they're inextricably linked, because of course, as the climate deteriorates, we'll lose millions of species, and we are losing. But also that if we rewild and put nature back, then it helps to act as a carbon sink. And one of our best forms of carbon capture is trees and plants and nature, right? So there is this kind of a really interesting piece happening around, particularly actually since the pandemic, and we've all become much more aware of nature and how important it is for us to get to that piece of green space on a daily basis. Bringing kind of nature into the city or the urban space, or sort of almost offsetting some of the urban impacts through rewilding some of the natural spaces. And I think that's going to be an increasing trend that we will see that tackles a bit of both, and also tackles all sorts of other things, right? Because we've also increasingly going to have to adapt to extreme climatic events. Nature-based solutions are a really good way of tackling resilience and adaptation in an urban environment. So there are multiple kind of benefits of putting those two together. And to give you a really practical example of a company that is doing that, just to bring it to life for people, British Land, a big listed PropCo property company, commercial property company here in the UK, one of our larger listed ones, have created a fund that they sort of self-administer, imposing, if you like, a carbon tax or a carbon price on all of the embodied carbon of their developments. And then they tax that internally, put that money into this fund, and then the fund invests in, amongst other things, rewilding and kind of forestry projects and various other things in the same country. So I think we're seeing this juxtaposition there that's really interesting. But there's no doubt there's lots of other ways of capturing carbon. I was reading one earlier today about marine kelp, and huge investments in kind of protecting some of those and protecting our peatlands and all of these things that act as stores that we've been willingly destroying without thinking. So we now need to quickly restore those.
I mean, I think people think like capturing carbon is some like outer space technology. We actually do it well today. I mean, you had mentioned refrigerants. We capture CO2 and use it as refrigerants in supermarkets, for example. So that's one application. Yeah. And if anybody's had a soda or a seltzer water in the last week, we call it carbonated water for a reason, because we actually put CO2 in it to make the bubbles. And so the issue is, how do we do that at scale to capture carbon? We're certainly going to need that. You had mentioned the pandemic, and I'll just pause for a second and say that we're starting to get questions in, so that's great. I have a few more for Julie, then we'll turn to the audience Q&A. I want to talk about social value, but first, I don't want to lose thought on the pandemic that you just mentioned. Has the pandemic slowed enthusiasm for net zero, or has that actually helped accelerate enthusiasm for net zero?
Very much the latter. I mean, we have never seen the momentum and the pace of that momentum and the pace of change in the last 12 months alone is unparalleled. I've been working on this stuff for 25 years, and I mean it is on a completely kind of exponential growth curve. It needs to be, right? We're still nowhere near, and we need to massively step up the action. But no, it has massively accelerated, and I think that's recognition from businesses that global systemic risks hit hard and relentlessly, and this is the next one that we face. So I just think there is a realization that this is a kind of value protection, value creation piece, but also all the other drivers you mentioned: investors, ESG, planning, and corporates now starting to specify through their procurement of space. So I think it's not going away.
So let's talk about social value. The UK Green Building Council has done a lot of good work around social value. In the United States, we call that environmental justice. It's the same activity, it's the same concept. How does net zero relate to social value?
So there's sort of two aspects to this. I mean, I'm intrigued that you equate it with environmental justice, which I guess I think of as a slightly different point. But social value has shot up by the way, in relevance in the UK, driven largely by some government policy around the Social Value Act and the need for public procurement to demonstrate that it's delivering value back to people through the contracts that it delivers. Actually, is the reason why I query the juxtaposition of environmental justice is that here in the UK, some of that social activity has left out some of the environmental.
Why is it really?
So there's been quite a kind of like, they're quite distinct and siloed, which is typically unhelpful, actually, because one has to think of these things as totally related. So that there's been this kind of growing appetite for what does social value really mean in the context of built environment. We've done a bit of work in that space in the last couple of years, and really we're defining it around sort of what do local people who are affected by the building or the scheme or the development or the project or the place need. Is it employment? Is it education? Is it health facilities? Is it and that the scheme itself is deemed to restore and put back additional value in some of those sort of local needs, so that it's serving it's fixing a societal need, I suppose, for want of a better way of putting it. We have put, and we believe that this is right through all the consultation that we've done, would put environment right at the heart of that, particularly local environmental quality like air quality, green access to green spaces, walkable, connected places, good public transport, etc., etc. So many of the things that we would consider to be hallmarks of a sustainable community actually are right at the intersect of the sort of the social and the environmental, but they do add, the environmental adds to the kind of community well-being. So that's sort of how, and we've just earlier this year launched a framework for defining social value, and we very much took that approach that it's a process that you need to go through on any given scheme to identify who are the people who will be affected, to consult with them heavily and on a continued basis, and then to kind of demonstrate that you've added more to their quality of life through whatever it is that you're doing to that place or building or what have you. So it's very much driven by quality of life. The connection with net zero, and perhaps the kind of the really interesting intersect, is around what we would call the just transition. So as we decarbonize our economy, there are some industries and jobs and individuals that could be affected much quicker and worse than others. And what we need, there's no point in us achieving net zero and leaving half the population behind and making people poorer and more destitute and so on. So there's been a big movement to try and say, well, actually, what are some of those jobs and people who get left behind, and how do we use this transition to actually ensure that it's just, it's fair, we're not leaving people behind, we're not exacerbating inequalities, we're actually fixing inequalities. And that takes you into the realm of the types of jobs, the types of skills, the sorts of sort of social justice kind of actions that you'd need to put in place to ensure that that transition is not adding to our social and socioeconomic woes, but is actually fixing some of them as well.
So in your vision, how would this really cool incorporation of social value be implemented? Would it be regulatory or a zoning process by a local government, or how would it roll out?
Ideally through the procurement process for whether it's construction or facilities management or energy management or all of the above, there ought to be stipulations and weighting placed on both people and planet kind of issues, right? And no contracts. And think public procurement, which for us is something like 40%, of our buildings. I mean, if they were driving through their procurement processes, net positive social value and net zero outcomes, we would be a lot further on than we are now. So that is a key driver. But every business can, and any developer and any local authority, and can push this through both the policies and the way in which they implement their core activities. And it really is that point about identify those that are affected listen to their needs, and then try and put their needs right at the heart of what the ultimate purpose of that scheme becomes for everyone involved.
So UK is going to host a big global meeting. It might be the first big,
we hope so, yeah.
in-person first international meeting post-pandemic. So global leaders are scheduled to meet in UK later this year to discuss next steps with the Paris Climate Agreement. It's called the Conference of Parties, COP. What outcome are you hoping for?
Well, there's a macro kind of geopolitical answer to that, which is we're hoping for many more nation states to ratchet up their nationally determined contributions and their emissions reduction ambitions and targets in order to give them confidence to do that. We're kind of bringing it down a level. That's why we're pushing so hard for corporate commitments, and not just corporate, I should say, non-state actors. So those universities, local authorities, and so on, cities, regions, super important, right? Because if you can demonstrate, as we think the Race to Zero is doing, that many of those are getting on board quickly, then we think the governments will start to pay, heed to that and have the confidence to raise their level of ambition. So there's clearly the success of COP26 depends on, in our view, a massive ratcheting up of global ambition in terms of us really trying to achieve that 1.5. If that doesn't happen, then I think the kind of Paris Agreement framework convention that we've got for international climate negotiations is under scrutiny and in question, really. So that's the first thing. And then from the perspective of UK built environment, for built environment to be seen as an absolutely crucial component of our own net zero transition as a country, and really for some of the kind of critical policies that are missing, frankly, to be introduced from government, national and local alike. And a really key point, and someone's put in the chat, I think for us, the biggest piece that's missing is kind of home energy efficiency and retrofit. I've got like 26 million homes that we need retrofitting to get them to net zero. That's like one every minute almost between now and 2050. That isn't happening. So we need a step change in some of that policy framework, and ideally COP26 provides the kind of lever point from which some of that starts to get agreed. We as an organization have lots of plans, as you might imagine, around hosting a virtual pavilion with a whole number of partners, an exhibition of really kind of inspiring sustainable places and buildings, a virtual conference. We've also hoping to do a number of events in situ on site. And we'll be launching a big project with many partners, which is a net zero whole life roadmap for the whole of the sector. I think these sector by sector roadmaps are really needed. And we don't yet have one in the UK to speak to. So, what is our science-based target as a sector, and which bits of the sector need to kind of drive to what outcome by when? Those are all some of our things that we're hoping to do in the next 6 months.
It's great. It's a lot. We need you. Please do it. Well, my last question is actually the first question of our audience Q&A. That's never happened before, so it's great to see that sinking. So let's switch over to the audience Q&A, and please continue to add it. You can see there you can upvote questions that you'd like to see move to the top of the list if you like. But the first question is, industry has been talking about net zero energy for a long time. As a consultant, what is the most important thing to talk to clients about to accelerate the shift to net zero? So my question to you is, what advice do you have for US companies to start thinking about net zero? And I think it's the same as this audience question. So how would you respond?
I think what's interesting about that question is there's two concepts in it. There's net zero energy and net zero carbon. And actually my answer, if I were just taking the latter bit of the question on net zero carbon, the most important thing for clients to understand would be that energy efficiency is the #1 starting point, that we need to reduce energy demand. We cannot get to credible net zero carbon by just using the same amount of energy and just trying to offset it or buy renewables. It's just not going to work. So that, I think that would be my piece of advice, was to talk about that piece that often gets overlooked, particularly in the corporate community, which is efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. That's the #1 priority.
Great. The next question is, you note that offsets need to be credible, which I agree with that too. So how is that defined? So take the bigger view here of how do we know an offset's a good offset?
I mean, again, there's sort of taxonomy around this now, which helps. Here in the UK, we had a report produced, I think, just earlier this year, or maybe late last year, called the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsets. I would definitely recommend that you take a look at that. But there's two bits. One is emission reduction. So you're investing in something that's reducing emissions that are otherwise going to take place elsewhere. And the other is direct carbon removal. And then the question there is kind of how is that stored? You know, is that how long is it short-lived or long-lived storage? And how are we kind of calculating that? So there are now standards out there. There's the gold standard for the global goals, which is probably the most globally relevant. And you know, would point to some of those and just say that it's back to this point that I was kind of making about renewable energy. The same point is about additionality. The credibility of the offset is about how is that, you know, carbon removal or avoidance being measured, evidenced and stored or maintained over time. If it's literally, you know, you've planted a tree, but it might get chopped down in 2 years' time, like that just doesn't wash. So some of these global standards have figured some of that out. And I would say, you know, definitely it's worth pinning on, you know, a flag to those masts. They've done the hard work. You know, let's hope there's more of them. But those are some of the points on credibility, I think, that need to be evidenced.
Yeah, we're going through the same issues in New York City. So our new carbon law, our carbon cap on buildings that comes into force in 2024, anticipates a 10% offset, which is yet to be defined. So we're going through those same issues about, you know, the classic tree planting is true. Trees do a nice job removing carbon, except you need to make sure the tree's around for 100 years. And so, you know, who's actually going to sit under the tree and make sure it's there 100 years from now is, you know, one of these big issues about the quality of the offset. Same thing on renewable energy credits. We just had a similar issue here in New York, where you know, there are different types of renewable power that you can buy, and the question is it additional or not? Are you supporting existing facilities, or are you actually creating new facilities? And those are all big parts of the consideration. Next question here is, it's exciting to hear that UKGBC is strongly encouraging corporate members to sign up to the race to zero, and then tightening your membership requirements about it. Is the USGBC doing the same thing?
You might be a better place to answer that than me. My understanding.
Yeah, we can take it on that, but maybe you could expand the question to let us know what the World GBC is doing and how that model is rolling out.
Yeah, so I mean, look, this is super hot off the press from me and the UKGBC. We only announced this to members 2 weeks ago. I haven't had a member pull out of membership yet, so that's good. You know, touch wood. But I was asked by World GBC to run a session for other GBC CEOs. Literally, actually a week before we announced it to the market and to our members. So I know that for many other GBCs that are in less established markets, that would be really tricky. And it's actually this point about, you know, to what extent are we there to sort of push and pull or support and nudge or encourage? And we agonized over some of that too, right? And our marketplace is pretty mature. So you're going to piss some people off by doing it. You know, they're going to think, well, that's not your place to tell me what to do. But I took the view, and my board took the view that we are now in our market at such a point that it's too reputationally risky for us not to do some of that. It has to mean something to be a member of ours. And frankly, if you don't have a commitment, I'm not sure we can help you. So, so if the marketplace is as mature as that, I would expect other GBCs will start to follow suit. Whether or not they align that to Race to Zero or not, I don't know, but we've definitely tried to put that out there as we've now paved the way by being recognized as an accelerator to the race, and hopefully other mature GBCs could come on coattails of that and do the same in due course, whether that's before or after COP, doesn't really matter. I don't know enough about US GBC's sort of membership model to know whether that would be appropriate for kind of all member types or what have you. But what I do know is that for us, it was important to distinguish between kind of fee-paying business members and all of those that are not, and make the core mandatory requirements relate more to those where we really have to have a transactional relationship and not so much the others. And for those that really are kind of trying to be leaders, then to really make that requirement more ambitious and challenging. So maybe if there's, I know there's different membership levels for USGBC, that would be something to consider at the top tier.
Sure. So our next question here is, as an architect, it's hard to ensure that your building will be net zero before it's built. So what are some of the strategies that the UK firms use to ensure that they meet their goals?
I think it's a really tricky one. So we've got a real problem here, which I think you and I, John, have discussed before, which we call the performance gap. So buildings are designed to kind of design models of that to kind of effectively, you know, digital models that predict their energy performance. And actually, when one monitors how they perform once they're built, they're often kind of woefully off beat on that. You know, it could be like up to 200% difference. So that factor is, I think, what we need to start kind of flipping in our kind of design and contractual relationships, is to incentivize for what the performance of the building is upon delivery and occupation. And actually, you can't really do that until you've got a year's worth of occupation to really work out how it's performing. So it's back to this kind of, you know, continuous feedback loop, and not delivering, you know, upon completion, we're done, dusted, you guys can come in and hopefully we've done our best. It's actually really bringing all of the parties involved, even the facilities managers who are going to be involved in the operating the building right up front in the design, and then monitoring that throughout, you know, post-completion and in operation, and having that kind of post-occupancy feedback loop, which is tricky because we're not, our contracts and leases and, you know, various construction procurement methods don't necessarily allow for that. So there is an initiative that is being trialled here in the UK. Our government is increasingly interested in it, and it's come from Australia, and it's called Design for Performance. And it is exactly that. It's incentivizing the right parties to actually make sure that how the building is used is what's driving the design decisions up front. But we're quite far off.
Right. And of course, I think also inherent in that question for new buildings and new construction is the whole embodied energy piece, which honestly is not thought of a lot. I don't see in the United States yet. It's starting to emerge, but maybe you could amplify on that a little bit on, you know, what should be the approach when you think about embodied carbon.
So, sorry, just so I understand the question, which bits of embodied should we tackle the most? Is that?
Yeah, but I think when we talk about existing buildings,
right.
the embodied carbon is there. I mean, you can't really
capture
it. But when you're talking about new construction, there's a big opportunity.
Yeah.
I don't think we're really quite thinking about that in the United States yet. So what's the thinking in the UK about embodied carbon?
Again, it's very early days. I mean, unfortunately, our government regulations are nowhere near stipulating for even the measurement and disclosure of embodied, let alone the driving down of embodied over time. So we've kind of missed a trick with that. And I think, you know, the embodied piece can be as big as 30, 40, 50% in some cases as we're driving down the operational emissions over the lifetime of the building. So it's absolutely crucial that we tackle that. Otherwise, we're fooling ourselves in terms of the nature and scale of the problem. There are some really exciting innovations starting to happen in some of those heavy carbon intensive industries like steel, cement and concrete. You know, in some parts of the world. I would say that requires a massive push from a procurement point of view, and the more we can get, you know, group purchasing power to play to really kind of make a difference there and give them confidence that it's worth investing what are effectively very vast sums of money for them to kind of decarbonize their manufacturing processes. You know, that's what's required, both policy and regulation, I think, and then really strong market signals. There is part of the race to zero, there's a steel zero initiative, for instance. So, you know, you could start to procure nothing but zero steel and grow the marketplace. Now, Some of these products, of course, are still in low supply, so more costly. What we need to do is really drive up that demand and then reduce the cost by, of production by doing so. So I think I'm encouraged to see some movement on the global level on some of that, but that is really the next biggest challenge, is to drive that right down.
Our next question is a great question about job force training. So do you see gaps in the workforce that need to be filled to shift the net zero carbon? What roles need to be filled? Who needs to be trained?
Yeah, that is, I mean, that is a huge question. The most obvious one that's come up repeatedly here in the UK is, we have gas boiler installers whose jobs are going to be obsolete if we make gas boilers obsolete, which is the prerequisite of us achieving net zero. And yet we have heat pump installers in very short supply. And people don't really understand what heat pumps are or what they do and how they work. So that's a really obvious one. That's coming back to the point I was making about the just transition. A just transition would say, we don't just kind of kick the gas boiler installers out and appoint new people who've got these heat pump electrical kind of qualifications and skills. We retrain, and we're future-proofing whole industries and kind of and job areas. So I think that's a really obvious one, and it's quite an acute one actually. Even sort of installers of insulation and air tightness kind of experts and those sorts of things. Our domestic energy efficiency policy framework has been in tatters for so long that there were virtually no skilled labour in those types of jobs because there isn't a market for them. So in trying to ramp this up really quickly, we're going to face that problem that there just isn't the skill set out there. And that was, our government conducted a really sort of embarrassing and slightly disastrous U-turn on a Green Homes grant, which was introduced actually as a green recovery policy to retrofit homes. And one of the main reasons it fell over was because just people couldn't find the skilled labour in their local areas to kind of come and do the works fast enough. So I think it's one that is a really big issue for the sector and actually does require some government intervention as well. Because without the certainty of the policy, people aren't just going to train themselves for a marketplace they don't think is going to be there in 2 months' time.
I guess it's refreshing in an odd way that we're not alone in New York and our challenge on this, because we're facing the exact same question, for example, on heat pump installation and who are the qualified people to actually do that. And I agree with you on the government intervention. We're starting to see out of our new administration in Washington an approach to job training in this area that we're hopeful for. Next question is another interesting question. Do we need to shift our nomenclature from net zero to either net zero carbon or carbon neutral buildings to signal what we really need to drive? So let's, in your view, is net zero carbon buildings and carbon neutral buildings the same thing?
No, again, I worry about the term carbon neutrality because it's been around for a really long time. And there are even organizations that are sort of called carbon neutral or carbon zero or what have you. But actually, I think neutrality doesn't bring the zero into it. So you could just carry on emitting. I mean, carbon neutral technically means you've offset or compensated for in some way the carbon that you've been responsible for. So you can get carbon neutral flight, or you can still get the flight, right? So for me, that doesn't signal the change in mindset and behavior and the transformational kind of market shift that's required. I know it's just words, but actually the zero bit, and it was interesting to hear you say how much is net and how much is zero. More zero, less net is the kind of, is really the mantra. And the zero bit is really important. We need to be emitting no carbon, if not doing carbon net, like to your point, sucking carbon back out. So just psychologically getting that term in there is important. I think to the question about, I think the bit that is definitely would add to certainty and clarity around what we mean is the point I made earlier about, are we talking net zero construction, or are we talking net zero in operation for 1 year, for 10 years? For what are we actually talking about when it comes to a built asset? And not specifying that is really problematic. And if you're calling a building net zero, a new development net zero, and you haven't tackled the embodied and you've just measured 1 year of operation, I mean, that's just, it doesn't make sense. Frankly, it's greenwash. So I would favor that we add onto the net zero carbon tag the life cycle stage and the kind of the, slightly more detail on how that it's backed up with a kind of disclosure on how that process got there, so we can figure that out for ourselves, whether that's fully net zero or credible or not.
Next question here. Does the UK have policies in place to confirm that buildings continue to be net zero so they don't slip from their goals? So, this is kind of interesting in the green building certification analogies, you have to recertify. So what's your view on net zero commitments? How do you keep people accountable for it?
So from a net zero carbon in operation point of view, we would say you have to re-disclose and demonstrate that every year. It is based on actual energy usage that could go up or down in any given year, and you need to be constantly accountable for it. You can't say, well, we did it 1 year and so we'll be like that for the next 10. We think that requires a constant measurement, disclosure, and sort of verification. But this kind of touches on the point I was making earlier. I mean, our policy framework, and the question asked about UK policy, our policy framework isn't based on performance in use. So it doesn't do that even with the kind of energy, the building regulations that we've got, which are not net zero, by the way. But even with those, we're not demonstrating any compliance on an ongoing basis. It's completely sort of off. So the whole kind of policy system needs to shift its attention to an in-use mindset. And we have got some encouraging policies being trialed at the moment for commercial buildings in particular, and for offices that are likely to come in soon. So that's quite exciting. This is sort of first trial of operational energy in use being disclosed and mandated and then hopefully regulated, and that will drive some of that. But again, we're not there yet.
Okay, next question is from Darcy, and you won't be surprised that Darcy's asked a tough question. So his question is, the UK government recently cut funding for domestic energy improvements, but still promotes energy efficiency in non-domestic buildings. Is this a sign of future policy or just a way for the government to reduce public spending post-COVID?
So this goes right to the jugular of why working in this space makes you feel slightly schizophrenic, because it was such great news that the government did finally hear that retrofit was a green recovery measure that generated jobs all over the country, whilst tackling energy efficiency and reducing emissions. It was a win-win-win, basically. They brought it out, and then within, we could have told them that it wasn't very well construed, but they brought it out too quickly, not well thought through enough, and then 3 months later, they didn't just, however many months later, they completely pulled the plug. And this is a market that requires really long-term investment. Like we said, the skills, jobs, and everything aren't there. They're not going to be there unless we can see 10, 15, 20 years out. So I'd say that is the most disappointed we've been as an organization for probably 6 years, since the zero carbon new building standards were pulled by the same government, different leadership at the time, but those were also pulled. There has been a really bad propensity to stop-start, policy making, and that is, I'm afraid, short-termist, vote-winning kind of mindset that just isn't going to tackle the scale of this challenge the way we need it to be tackled. Whether it's a sign of future policy, there are, like I said, there are some really encouraging policies coming through. Not fast enough, if you ask me, but that there are around commercial buildings, around energy performance certificates and minimum energy efficiency standards and so on. And those aren't being quite so stop-start, but actually the hardest nut for us to crack is this existing homes. Mm-hmm. And on that one, we have had a plethora of disastrous policies. So I can say no more than that. The first to government bash on that one.
Well, we have time for one last question, and there is one last question, so that's great. And so this question gets back to the heart of defining what net zero is. It says, I was surprised to hear that the definition of net zero was still up for grabs, or did I misunderstand? There was a reference to what percentage of net zero would be required. I think I saw out of the UKGBC that you're suggesting that 60% of the effort should be in energy efficiency, and then you scale. You have, if you're going to do renewable, it should be additional. If you're going to do offsets, they should be clear. Is that the proportion that did I get that right? Is that the proportion you're looking at?
Well, it depends on the asset type, and it depends on which point in time we're looking at. So I mean, we put out it's not an infographic, it's a brief report, which will be on our website, where we try to break down what this kind of definition, the steps to achieving, and again, we split it between construction and in operation, and the kind of the baseline performance from now, what the minimum things you've got to get right, and then going all the way to sort of 2050, there are going to be some big shifts in the market and big tightening of that definition. So we're definitely not advocating for it to stay still. We're advocating for it to get tighter and tighter and tighter and more stringent over time, both the energy efficiency component and the other components. At the moment, we're saying there are some tariffs that you can buy that, because you can't buy anything else on the marketplace, might be okay today, but in 5 years' time, we wouldn't consider those to be okay for a net zero carbon definition. So it is a slightly more complex science rather than this is what it is and it's never going to change, partly because of the immaturity of some bits of the marketplace. But that kind of set of tables that we put out would definitely help to demonstrate where we think the different component parts need to get to.
Well, Julie, I want to thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion. Julie Hirigoyen, the CEO of UKGBC, thanks for spending time on Urban Green Live today. Really
welcome.
Benefited from the discussion. I know our audience has too.
Welcome.
Great. So today's program is a good example of what we do at Urban Green. We take on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions that have the biggest impact. And I'm glad that you were able to join us for that. I'm going to thank, again, our sponsor today, which has been Carrier, for this episode of Urban Green Live. I certainly appreciate their support. On the upcoming events, call your attention to our conference. Our 2021 conference on June 23rd is Climate, Equity, and Health, No More False Choices. I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion about how going forward in the real estate industry that we have to optimize for climate, health, and equity together, and not pit one against another inadvertently or otherwise. That has sometimes been the case in the past. So this will be a great discussion, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. So a big thank you again to Julie for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on the next program. Stay safe and stay well.